Good morning. With the help of Hashem, we are learning Yerushalmi Demai, Pedig Dalit, Halachic Gimel. We're learning Daf Lamed Zayin. We left off on Daf Lamed Zayin, Amud Aleph, 3 lines from the top of the Amud. We just finished learning a Machlokes regarding a case in which we know that Ha'aretz removed Ma'aser Sheni. Now the question is whether based on that we may presume regarding that produce only, that since the Ha'aretz was careful in removing the Ma'aser Sheni, did he also remove the Ma'aser Rishon? And indeed, Rabbi Eliezer holds that Hanemon la Sheni, Nemon la Rishon. However, the Chachamim hold that Nemon la Rishon, Nemon la Sheni, as we explained yesterday, because Rishon is harder to separate because you have to fully give it away. So if someone even does Ma'aser Rishon, we could and we do presume regarding that basket, regarding that pile, that even though this person is not yet a Nemon, he's Nemon that he also separated Ma'aser Sheni, even though we didn't see it. But the Chachamim argue with Rabbi Eliezer, and they hold that Hanemon la Sheni, Einoi Nemon Lorisha. That's where we left off. Now, the Hemshach was on Daf Lamed Zayin. We're going to learn a new Braisa. There, the case will be that the Ha'aretz brought out produce from his home. We had no idea what it is. Normally, we would presume that it's the might. The Ha'aretz says, what I brought out now was Ma'aser Sheni that I redeemed. Now, the question is whether one is allowed to eat from it or not. We will see how this is linked to this topic of Rabbi Eliezer and the Chachamim. And actually, we're going to introduce a new din that we never spoke about yet, and that is called Tosefes Bikurim. Now, Bikurim is the mitzvah that when any one of the Shivas Haminim begins to bud, begins to grow, the owner puts a mark, he puts a gemi, he ties a ribbon, he ties a grass around it, and he declares that this will be Bikurim. And when he will harvest that product, he will take the Bikurim, and they'll bring it to Yerushalmi. Now, what happens if when a person filled up his basket, her basket with Bikurim, they want to add something, but what they are adding is not the first of the product. You know, a person was designated and now has the Bikurim, let's say, of grapes in a basket, but they want to add grapes to the basket. That's called Tosefes Bikurim, and we will see certain unique halachas that we say regarding Tosefes Bikurim and how all of that will be tied into this topic of what we just mentioned, that if Ha'aretz brings out produce and he says, this was Ma'aser Sheni, which I now redeemed, will determine better the status of that product. That will be Daf Lamed Zayin Amud Aleph. On Daf Lamed Zayin Amud Beis, we're going to refer back to the second rule that we learned in Halacha Gimel. The Mishnah said the words that mi shekara shein letrumas ma'aser shel demai, or ula ma'aser ani shel vadai. The words of the Mishnah is lo yitleim b'Shabbos, and as we explained when we learned the Mishnah yesterday, that even though literally the Mishnah seems to be saying that a person may not actually separate, whether it is the example of trumas ma'aser shel demai or ma'aser ani shel vadai, we're speaking about whether it's bona fide ma'aseres or demai ma'aseres. Literally, the Mishnah says you can't separate it on Shabbos. Really, we know that that's not true. The Isur Midrabanan is not to designate part of the produce as trumas u'ma'aseres, because the designation, the kriya shein, is that which is misaken, which is something that we may not do. Tikkun mana. Once a person already designated trumas u'ma'aseres from their produce, the actual act of separation in itself is not accomplishing anything. And therefore, we learned the Mishnah, as we'll see more in the Gemara, and the words lo yitleim b'Shabbos doesn't mean not to physically separate it. It means something completely different. Whether you separate it or not, that there is an Isur Midrabanan not to give Trumais u'ma'aseres, whether vadai or whether shel demai, to its intended recipient on Shabbos, and as we'll see in the Gemara, neither on Yom Tov. That is the Isur Midrabanan that our Mishnah is referring to. let's speak out now in our words of Hagdama that the reason for this Isur Midrabanan, in other words, you're not allowed to deliver it on Shabbos nor on Yontiv, because the Chachamim were afraid that if you will deliver it to the recipients, then you might actually come to separate them, which means you might actually come to designate them. One might lead into the other, or minimally there is a maras ayin, minimally, that's another reason, perhaps, that an observer will think that you actually did the designation on Shabbos or on Yontif, which is also, again, midrabanan. Now, I know that normally we don't make Gzeda, Ligzeda, but that's the din over here, that lo yitla Shabbos means you may not deliver trumais or maisres to their intended recipients. Our Mishnah gave an exception that if you have kohanim or aniyim that are regularly your guests, so it's not that they're really being invited special for you to be able to give it to them. They always come to your house. Then you could give it to them on Shabbos, to the truma, to the kohen, the meiser ani, to the ani. However, you have to notify them that what you're giving them is not out of your kindness of the heart, but you're giving them something that really already belongs to them. We're going to quote a Mishnah in Beitza. We're going to see that there is a similar implied halacha from a Mishnah in Beitza regarding this din of not actually delivering trumas or maisres to its recipients on Shabbos or on Yontiv. The Gemara is actually going to point out that every Mishnah, the one in Demai and the one in Beitza, has a chiddush, has a novelty, and one teaches the other. And if we'll have time, we'll begin the topic of Genevas Das, the prohibition of stealing one's mind, which means affecting deception. That's, by the way, included one of the times the Torah says loisig noivu. It includes the isur of Genevas Das, which is why you have to notify the kohen that what I'm giving you is already truma, or notify the ani, not to make them think that you're being more benevolent than you really are, because you're really giving them what's theirs. They don't owe you that which you might imply that you owe them. You have to be honest with them. So we're going to at least open up the topic of the isur of Genevas Das. All right, Daf Lamed Zayin, Amud Aleph, by the 2 dots, 3 lines from the top of the Amid. Guys, just remember again, the Machloikas, Rabbi Eliezer and the Chachamim, right? Rabbi Eliezer is the one that's Mechadesh, that Hanemon, even only L'Sheni, is Nemon L'Rishoin. The Chachamim argue with that. And now we're going to quote a new Braisa. Now, this Braisa is not attributed, it's not attributed to any specific Tana. And let's begin. Says the Braisa that if a person, if you have an Amaretz who takes out produce, we don't know what it is, which normally means that we presume that it's Damai. And this Amaretz notifies us. He's the one that says, this that I'm taking out, I want you to know, this is my designated Meiser Sheni. That's the meaning of Hoitzi Lehem Meiser Sheni. But then he adds, but this Meiser Sheni I already redeemed. Amalahem, that it's Padoihu. Now, the din is, the Braisa begins by saying that Nemon, that the Amaretz is believed. Now, I know that normally we would include this in the rule of Hapesha Asad Hapesha Yitir. That's not the approach we're going to learn here at all. Look inside the Rashirilio all the way at the end of the right column, the second to last line, right? The first case of the Braisa, that Amalahem Padihu Nemon, Vafilu Shuhu Amaretz. Why do we believe him? Mipnei she'emas kidushasei alav. Lefikach neman afilo al hafrashasei. That I know on one hand, right? If you buy produce from an Amaretz, the buyer, the chaver, has to separate Meiser Sheni. On the other hand, Meiser Sheni has kedusha. So once the Amaretz says this is Meiser Sheni and I redeemed it, emas kedushasei of Meiser Sheni on the Amaretz. So we believe him that he redeemed it. Now, says the Braisa, that if he says it in a way that he implies that I know that you can still be suspicious of me, means the Hamaretz says that Padoi Li, I redeemed it. In other words, I know that I can eat it, but if you don't trust me, Upadu Lachem, if you don't trust me, you know what? You can redeem it for yourselves. It's an amazing statement. If someone goes beyond, sometimes wow, sometimes the opposite. He is implying that there's room for suspicion. The moment he does that, Gavaldik, and he loses his credibility. Now, the Gemara is going to focus on the first case of the Braisa, which is the normal case. This is Maisa Sheni, and I want you to know that I already redeemed it. That was the end of his statement. So we're saying that we believe him. Now I got a problem. What's my problem? It works. We believe him that this was Maisa Sheni, and we believe him that it was redeemed. But I have a problem. My problem is that how do I know that prior to this Am Ha'aritz's removing of the Maisa Sheni, he removed Maisa Rishon? Maybe he didn't. And if he didn't, even though this is Taka Padui from the Kedusha of Maisa Sheni, but you still have in it Maisa Rishon. You still have in it the Trumas Maisa that you have to remove from the Maisa Rishon. The Braisa doesn't insinuate that you have to be worried about it. Fakir, the case of the Braisa is that since he said it's Maisa Sheni and he redeemed it, Neman, meaning you, the Chaver, can now eat it. So Bishleima, if this only follows Rabbi Eliezer, which is the initial approach of our Gemara, it works because we have a rule that we learned at the end of yesterday's shir that Haneman Lasheni, Neman Ladishon. Again, Neman Lasheni, Neman Ladishon doesn't mean that this person becomes a Neman Lamaisrus. No, for that he has to do the Kabbalah that we learned in the previous chapter. What we're speaking about for this batch, that once we see that this person, either we see or halachically we know he removed even only Maisa Sheni, he's Neman that over here, he didn't do one before the other, he did it all. He took off the Maisa Rishon. So that's what the Gemara is saying. That our Braisa, Masnisa, means the Braisa, L'chu'ura, only follows Rabbi Eliezer, because it is only Rabbi Eliezer is the one that holds, says the Gemara, Haneman al Hasheni, Neman al Harishoy, Masha'en Kein L'chu'ura, according to the Chachamim, who holds Haneman Lasheni is only Neman Lasheni. Haneman L'rishon, Neman Lasheni. Haneman Lasheni ain't a Neman L'rishon. Neman, and you can eat it, is not true. Even though L'chachamim taka Neman, that this is Maisa Sheni, but you got to worry about the Maisa Rishon. You have to worry about the Trumas Maisa. So Neman doesn't help you. You still got a problem with the Mai. So begins our Gemara. Really, as we mentioned, there's a Machlekes Amoyroim. So the Gemara says, Amar Rabbi Yosi, the Amoyre Rabbi Yosi says, I disagree with your presumption. That I can argue that this Braisa that we began today is Divrei HaKolim, is according to everyone, even according to the Chachamim. And now the question is why? So says the Gemara Gavaldik. The logic would be that this, not everything else of this batch, but this Maisa Sheni that we believe was Maisa Sheni and was redeemed, it now maybe eaten l'kol ha'alma, because it becomes like Tosefes Bikurim. So guys, Nachamal, primary Bikurim is what we always know to be Bikurim. You learn Pashas Kisave, right? You're a farmer, any one of the Shivas Haminim, you know that you have to bring the first to the Beis HaMikdash. So what happens is that when the first begins to bud, you put a sign on that branch around that fruit to be, right? You tie a knot with a rubber band. Then they used to use a grass, a gemi, and this is Bikurim. And when you harvest it, whenever that is, you put it in a basket and you bring it to Yerushalmi. That is primary Bikurim. And Chevra, primary Bikurim is completely exempted from Trumas Omaisis, right? I mean, you have to give it to the Kohen, but the Kohen it's not Tebel, even though you remove nothing from it. You remove Bikurim before you remove Trumas and the Maisis. Doesn't matter. Bikurim is completely exempt from tithings. Now there is a din that if a person wants to make his basket of Bikurim even more beautiful, Bachal was a whole thing, and how you placed what in the basket. If you remember, we learned in the Rambam that then they would put birds on the edges of the baskets. They would go up by playing musical instruments. There was a whole beautiful, let's say, hidur that was done by Bikurim. Minimally, a person wouldn't want for the basket to be half empty. So the din is that after I filled up the basket with primary Bikurim, if I want to add to it, I take from my produce that wasn't tithed yet, and I put it in the basket, and it becomes now this Tosefes Bikurim. Now, what is the halacha of Tosefes Bikurim? So says the Mishnah, this is a Mishnah Bikurim, that ma Tosefes Bikurim, even though it's coming from Yama Aretz, from whom's produce we normally presume that they are in a state of Tumah. But because of the carefulness that the Eimas Kachin, the Am Ha'aretz would never put for his Tosefes Bikurim something that became Tamei, and we trust him for that. So number one says the Mishnah, Tosefes Bikurim Necheles Betara. The Kohen can presume that it was Tahar, even though it's not real Bikurim. And another din is Turam and Adamai. That's going to be the big Chiddush over here. Now, why do we say that it's Turam and Adamai? What does that mean? So look inside the second to last narrow lines in the Maharafulda, right? Ketesefes Bikurim, the Tanan we learned in a Mishnah, the Perek Basra of Mesechtes Bikurim, Tesefes Bikurim, V'hainu, Iker Bikurim. The primary Bikurim is the Ta'ena or the Eshkoil, should be Kadishan. When it began to bud, you put the sign and you say, this is the first of the batch, and that is Taka Bikurim. The Tosefes is that if you want to add later, you can add, even though it's not really Bikurim. Now, Omar Koyin, Lekeach Ma'amoritz. Oisam Tisefes, the Mishnah says that the Koyin that's receiving from the Amoritz, not only the primary Bikurim, but also the Tisefes, they are exempt from the Mai. This is important. The added Bikurim may not be added prior to tithing it, because it's not really Bikurim. Fine. Problem is that normally, when you get produce from Ha'aretz, even though he's telling you he separated all of the Trumas and all of the Mises, we don't trust him. We don't trust him. And normally you, the recipient, you have to remove, as we keep on learning, Trumas Meiser and Meiser Sheni. Says the Mishnah Bikurim that if the Ha'aretz is saying that what I added to the Bikurim is fully tied, he has Ne'emonus, and the Kohen doesn't have to separate the normal Demai separation. So Hachinami suggests, the Gemara suggests Rabbi Yossi, I'm reading inside the Barafulda, Hai Maisa Sheni is Patim and Adamai. What was the problem? The problem is that let's go, again, whether it's Hapesha Asar, Hapesha Hitter. Really, like we said, the Rasharili on the other Noisikalim here don't go on that level. They use the logic of Amos Kacham Aleph. So that there is the manus that this was Maisa Sheni and it was redeemed, we get. But what about the Trumas Meiser? What about that? In other words, the Meiser Rishon wasn't separated, from which there was no separation of Trumas Meiser. So says Rabbi Yossi, that just like we find by Tosefes Bikurim, that the Kohen doesn't have to be concerned with any of the Demai tithings, this Meiser Sheni proper, we don't have to worry that he never took off the Meiser Rishon, he never took off the Trumas Meiser, that's all inside the Meiser Sheni. So what that you resolved the Meiser Sheni issue, but what about the Meiser Rishon issue? For this, there was an exemption. Hold on. The Chachamim didn't say so before, so the Marafulda just says beautiful. That Rabbi Yossi's suggestion that this Braisa is L'Kula Alma is only regarding this Meiser Sheni that we now know, we believe, halachically was redeemed in the dot, in the Marafulda. That Ein Neman L'Rishon means that if you're Neman L'Sheni, you're not Neman L'Rishon. It means that on the remaining produce, Lahafrish Mishar HaPeira Shehifrish Mehen HaMaisa Sheni. We saw the Amaretz, that the Braisa that we learned yesterday, removing the Maisa Sheni. You now, the Chaver, you get the remaining produce. You still have to deal with Maisa Rishon, Kriya Shem, and the actual separation of Trumas Maisa from the remaining of the produce. Our Braisa is speaking about this Maisa Sheni itself that was now Nivdeh. Avala Maisa Sheni Atzma Yispated. And that makes a lot of sense, says the last line of Marafulda. The Loigara Maisa Sheni Zeh Mitoisefes Bikurim. Same concept, just like Bikurim. Eimas Kachim Halav. Maisa Sheni itself, the Maisa Sheni itself, there's a certain, let's go with the Rashirilya, there's a certain Kedusha involved. When he is saying that this is Maisa Sheni Shenifte, we can now trust that this is completely okay. Lefikach patur hamaisa sheni from the demai. Let's go back in the Gemara. Nachamol. This is the sheet of Rabbi Yosef. Nechalos betahara pturim min ademai. Af zeh nechal mishum sheni upater min harishain. Very good. Now, Shalom al Yisrael. So you have a machlekes between the Gemara Masnisa that Rabbi Eliezer is not attributed to which Amoira. The Gemara is pushing back that Rabbi Yossi argues by making a link, comparing it to Tosefos Bikurim. So now the Gemara says, Amar Rabbi Chanina b'shem Rabbi Isi, I disagree with you, Rabbi Yossi, that this Braisa that we began, and it says Padahun Neman, is only Rabbi Eliezer. Oh, the Tosefos Bikurim was never included under the Gzeira of Damai. That's the pshat. That's why we have a place to be lenient. Masha Enken, when it comes to our scenario, the Maisa Sheni came from produce that was included. It was subject to the Mai obligations. On top of that, this Maisa Sheni now is divested from its sanctity. Emas Kachim Olav is only when it is Maisa Sheni. Now you're telling me, Neman, that it was Padui. So if it's Padui means there is no more Kedusha on it. Maisa Sheni, that's Padui, has no Kedusha on it. You can eat it anywhere. It was initially included in the Gezeidah of the Mai. So according to the Chachamim, you're back to the problem. It's back included to the Gezeidah of the Mai. Now, we know that Maisa Sheni was resolved in this case. Fine, Neman for Maisa Sheni. The Chachamim hold Haneman L'Sheni and Haneman L'Rishoy, the Kitzur, and therefore Rabbi Chanina b'shem Rabbi Isi argues with Rabbi Yossi, and it's not the end of the world. And this Braisa, even though it doesn't say Divrei Rabbi Eliezer, indeed only follows the Shita of Rabbi Eliezer. Atkan, the first part of Halacha Gimel, and now we're going to turn to the Aflam Zayin on the base, and we're going to start focusing on the second law of Halacha Gimel that we learned yesterday. And here again, the Chiddush here will be that the Mishnah says words, and as we spoke out when we learned the Mishnah, and as we spoke out in the words of introduction, and as we'll read it now in the Gemara, that the Gemara right away knows that the words of the Mishnah may not be interpreted literally. The Mishnah says the words "Mi shekara shem l'trumas ma'aser shel demai," which means that prior to Shabbos, a person already made the designation, which is the ikar, either trumas ma'aser of demai, or the Mishnah wants to make it clear that this gzeiras chachamim of not gifting, of not giving the trumais umaisras that were already designated to the recipients on Shabbos, and as we'll see on Yom Tov, this Gezeirim Midarabanan is not only concerning the Mai, it's concerning proper Maisras and concerning the Mai, right? So that's why the Mishnah gives one example of the Mai, Maiser Sheni Shel Demai, or another example of Maiser Ani Shel Vadai, whichever one it is, you already did the Kriyas Hashem. So the Mishnah says the words Lo Yitleim B'Shabbos. The words Yitle means don't take it on Shabbos. And as we spoke out, that's not true. Those words were written for a reason, but it doesn't mean what it sounds like. Because once a person designated Trumas Umaisras prior to Shabbos, the remaining produce is completely Mesukam. You're not fixing anything on Shabbos. You can eat the rest. And therefore, you can actually physically take it. You can do the actual separation. You could do that. You're not doing anything halachically, which is prohibited. What the Mishnah means with the words lo yitleim is lo yitneim. That's what the Mishnah means. Don't give it to the recipient. Number one, either because Gezeiras Chachamim, if you'll give it, you might separate it, or similarly, the observer who will see you giving it on Shabbos or on Yom Tov might think that you actually did the designation on Shabbos and on Yom Tov. And they'll think you're allowed to do it when you may not, because it's midrabanan called tikkun mana. And again, just to know that tikkun mana, there's a machlekes whether tikkun mana is included in makabeh patish or whether tikkun mana is included in the malacha of boin, fixing a utensil, fixing something. Now, fixing something is also midoraisa when you're doing a fix that's discernible to the eye. When you're doing a halachic fixing, that's already only asur midrabanan. Whether it's separating tithing, whether it's taking something to the mikvah, parshas hashavua, the taher, we're not allowed to eat from kelim that belong to a guy prior to taking it to the mikvah. Tefillas kelim. According to many people, it's a doiraisa. So can I toivel something on Shabbos? Midoiraisa, yes. Midrabanan, no. Because I'm changing its halachic status, even though it's not discernible. It's called tikkun mana. I'm fixing this yutat. Okay. Says the Gemara, Keina masnisa be'emes, what the Mishnah means to say, even though the words are lo yitleim b'Shabbos, is lo yitneim. See, that's the key. Don't give it to the recipient. But you know what you are allowed to do? You actually are allowed to yitleim. When are you allowed to do yitleim? If the Kriyas Hashem was done before Shabbos or before Yom Tov. Givaldik. Now, the Gemara will now quote a Mishnah in the Masechtas Beitzam. Perek Aleph in the Yerushalmi will be Halacha Ches. And this Mishnah, from its implication, we will again clearly see there also, they were speaking about Yom Tov. The Isur Midrabanan of giving Truma Somaisris. There, the Mishnah is actually going to be speaking about Chala, which is like Truma. The halach of Chala is like Truma. There was another din that's not Shabbat, not Shayach on Shabbos, and that is called Matonis. Matonis is that when you shech any domesticated animal, right, cattle, sheep, and goats, then according to all the opinions other than one, Bein ba'aretz, bein b'chutz la'aretz, only Rabbi Elo holds that this mitzvah is only in Eretz Yisrael. It's amazing how most paskin like Rabbi Elo, which is a chiddush. Normally you don't paskin like the minority. There were great people that actually did not follow Rabbi Elo, and they held that matanos has to be given midoiraisa even b'chutz la'aretz. Now there are other ways that people can get out of it, but the ain't kanamakim. The matanis are that the zroya, the right forearm, and the lichoyayim, which is the tongue and the jaw, expensive meat, and one of the four animals of an animal that's called the keva has to be gifted to a kohen. It also, unlike challah, it doesn't have the kedusha of truma.
But the udder, really?
No, the keva is not the udder. I think it's called the maw. It's one of the four stomachs of the animal. These are expensive gifts. It has no kedusha, unlike challah, but it has to be given to the kohen. Now, on Shabbos, we're not allowed to shecht. When you shecht, after the shechit, you give it. On Yom Tov, you are allowed to shecht. Even though certain food preparations are not allowed to be done on Yom Tov, the rule is any food prep that if you would have done it on Erev Yom Tov, it would have been just as fresh as if you did it on Yom Tov proper. For example, harvesting wheat. For example, turning kernels into flour. If I did it Erev Yom Tov or on Yom Tov, the bread will be equally as fresh. But kneading, from when you kneading on Yom Tov and baking on Yom Tov will give me bread that's fresher on Yom Tov versus if I would have kneaded it yesterday. So we are allowed today, we're allowed to knead and bake bread on Yom Tov. We are allowed to shecht on Yom Tov because meat that comes from an animal that was slaughtered today is fresher than meat from an animal that was slaughtered yesterday. So on Shabbat, on Yom Tov, you can actually make a dough. Now, when does the chiyuv of challah begin? When you knead. When does the chiyuv of the matanos go into effect? After you shecht. Before you shecht, there's no matanos. So on Yom Tov, you are chayiv to separate challah. We don't say, oh, you're not allowed to do tikkun mana. We don't do that, which is what, like we said, it's only rabbinically prohibited. There is no isur darabanan, because if it would be usur, then I would never shecht on Yom Tov. Then I would never need a dough on Yom Tov. Then I wouldn't have fresh food on Yom Tov. So on Yom Tov you can separate the challah. On Yom Tov you separate the gifts. But now we have the same question. One thing is to separate. When I separate that which needs to be separated, now I'm allowed to eat the remaining. Question is, can I gift it to the kohen? Answer is no. Says the Mishnah that Beishamai Oimrim, Ein moilichen chalo umatonis lekohen b'yom tov. You may not deliver, whether it is the challah, whether it is the zraya lechayayim and the keva. And the Beishamai says, Bein shohurmu me'emesh, bein shohurmu ma'hayoim. Whether they were separated yesterday, So you can argue that since you separated already yesterday, you should have given it yesterday. You can say, okay, so that you can't do. Maybe you would think, but if you shechted it today, if you made the dough today, that means you only separated the challah today. You weren't able to give it yesterday. Maybe in this case, let us allow for you to do it. The answer is no. You may never do it. Okay? And Beis Hillel have an exception. And by the way, Beis Hillel, of course, agrees with our Mishnah. The difference between Trumas and Maasros, like we just mentioned, is because Trumas and Maasros may not be separated on Yom Tov. Ever. So even Beis Hillel is moida that since they're not allowed to be separated, they're not allowed to be delivered. Because if you'll deliver it, you might separate it. The difference between that and challah and matanis is because challah and matanis are allowed to be separated on Yom Tov. So that's why the civil soul, since you're allowed to separate it, you're allowed to give it. The whole reason why you can't give it is because you might separate it. You are allowed to separate. Okay, what do we see from over there? The Mishnah in Beitza is not speaking about the separation. Beis Shammai is not speaking about the separation. No one will hold that you can't separate challah. If you can't separate challah, then how can you bake bread on Yom Tov? How can you shech on Yom Tov? So just like we see from the Mishnah in Beitza that the issue is not the separation of, the issue is the delivery. That clarifies that even though the words that we have in Masechtas Demai is lo yitleim, it doesn't mean lo yitleim, it means lo yitneim. That's number one. Number two, the Gemara goes even better. Let's go to the next step. Why do we need to have two Mishnayos? Because each one is adding a novelty, but the novelty that's added, one teaches the other. That's the next line. That hado yolfa minai. That hado means the details, the extent of the Mishnah. Minai hado. I'm sorry. From the Mishnah over here, we extend the details from here to there and from there to here. Now it explains the Gemara. That what do we learn from over there that we extend over here? That he Yom Tov, he Shabbos. If not for the Mishnah and Beitza, maybe I would think that the Isur again is only on Shabbos, because like we mentioned, on Shabbos you're not allowed to separate. So therefore on Shabbos you're not allowed to deliver. I need to know that even on Yom Tov, Beis Shammai, and I'll tell you more than that. Even Beis Hillel only allows the delivery of what? Beis Hillel allows the delivery of challah and matanos, which implies that even Beis Hillel prohibits the delivery of trumos or maasros on Yom Tov. So that's why we need to have the Mishnah and Beitz, which is, by the way, many people call that Masechtas Yom Tov. We learned this when we learned the Babel. We call it Masechtas Beitz or Masechtas Beya. Okay. Now, now the question now will be is that if when you learn the Mishnah and Beitza, you see there's an argument only regarding matanos and challah, which implies that l'kula alma, even the Beis Hillel, like whom we pass, like whom we follow, right? You're not allowed to deliver the trumas or maasros. Well, if we have that by implication, by Yom Tov, why would we not know on our own that for sure you cannot deliver it on Shabbos? We would know it on our own. So why do we have to have this Mishnah B'chlal? Because there was something new in our Mishnah that we don't have over there. And that is what the Mishnah writes after the opening rule, that you can't deliver it on Shabbos. What does the Mishnah say? That if the Kohen or the Levi, which are the two examples, right? The Kohen for Trumas Meiser of the Mai, the Ani from Meiser Ani of Vadai, that if they are limudim loichal etzloi, if they habitually eat by you, if they always eat by you, you can give it to them on Shabbos and on Yom Tov. It's an exception that we don't have in Beitza. So now, from this, we learn over there that the same exception you have on Shabbos, the same exception you have on Yom Tov. That's what the Gemara says. That in the case of limudim means if that recipient is accustomed to be eating by you. I just want to make it clear. Maybe we didn't speak it out yesterday. That means that if I normally don't invite the kohen to eat on my table on Shabbos or on Yom Tov, I'm not allowed to invite them to get rid of, so to say, my Trumas Meiser. I'm not allowed to do that. Only if the kohen anyways regularly comes to eat in my house, then when I give him the food, I can give him what belongs to the kohen, even though normally I'm not allowed to deliver it. Because anyways, he eats by me. He regularly eats by me. And that same heter is set for Yom Tov. And now the Gemara is gonna focus on that, which implies Abel b'she'ein lemudim. If this kohen or if the ani, I know bein b'Shabbos Mesechtas Demai, bein b'Yom Tov Mesechtas Beyom, Mesechtas Beitza. If it's not lemudim, then you're not allowed to invite them. Why? Loy salak al bar nosha mechal pesasi bebeise de chavrim. All of this, if you don't regularly eat in my house, you're not going to rely on eating on my house. And if you are not relying and eating around my table, then I'm violating the Isun Midrabanan of giving away the Trumais or the Trumas Meiser to the Kohen. I'm giving something to him that he never expected to have. Or if the Ani was not a regular guest in my home, the Ani was not relying on receiving the Meiser Ani from me on Shabbos. By me inviting him, I'm giving it to him. That's the Isun Midrabanan. It's only when they are Limudim Etzloi, Limudim. I think the words in the Mishnah is loichal etzloi. And then the final word in the Mishnah, we have enough time, which is great. The final word in the Mishnah is that even when this kohen or the ani are regular guests, and therefore this is not included in the Isur Darabanan of giving on Shabbos, you could have them and serve them, but you, the host, you have to inform them that you're giving them that which belongs to them, not to mislead them. That's what we explained, for them to think that he has done them a favor. And that's the key thing. That means if I'm doing something for you, but it's not as great as a favor as you think, I am deceiving you. That's called genevas das, that's called deception, that's asin midoy raisa. The Torah writes many times, thou shalt not steal. We're not repeating the same issue. Like in the Aseres HaDibros, it means not to kidnap and to sell people. That's the loy signoivu. You have in Parshas Kedoshim. One of the times that Hashem writes, don't steal, it means don't steal someone's mind, which means don't deceive. Deception is called genevas das. What's called deception? Even this. You're a host. You're giving them food. If you won't notify the kohen guest that I'm giving you truma, you're deceiving the kohen by having him think that you're doing a greater favor than what you did. And let's see how far we're going to get. How far do we extend the prohibition of this type of deception? So says the Gemara Tana, we learned in a Braisa. It's a great example. A person should not urge his fellow to be his guest when he already knows that, let's say, the invitee is already invited elsewhere. In other words, if I know that you will not, you don't need my invitation. I know that. For me to come to my house, what am I trying to show you? That I'm very hospitable to you. It's not true. I'm very hospitable to you because I know that you don't need my my invite because you are already invited out. Actually, if I would think that you're going to take my invitation, maybe I would not invite you to begin with. That's a great example of deception. People saying certain things when they know the recipient is not going to accept it, but they want to appear to be benevolent. And by the way, even if they would have been benevolent, it's also called genevas das. Because right now, I know the outcome already. And if a person, tekroivis means matana means a gift. The word tekroivis is a broader word. The tekroivis is from like a carbon, from a service. If I know you don't need my service or a gift, I know you're not going to receive it. I should not insist for you to take it, because what I'm doing with that is that I know you're not going to take it. So what am I doing? I'm a very generous guy. That's called genevas das. And even if I think I'm generous, I might have a misunderstanding of myself. That's very important. I don't know. In other words, how would I act if I would think you might accept a gift? Maybe I wouldn't have given it to you. I don't even know that. So it's really, I'm going of my das, I'm going of your das. The same idea. He knows the other person won't accept the gift. Don't insist on giving it. Now, the fact that the Braisa uses the words tikroivis and not the word matana. Matana is a thing. Tikroivis could be used when you're giving someone a thing. It could be used when you're giving someone a service. It's a more inclusive word. So says the Gemara, my tikroivis. It means, for example, yada duhurechitz. You have a guest in your house, and let's say the minig was, by the seder, what we should do to our parents once they reach a certain age, you bring them the natilas yadayim to the table. It's a service, right? You're being very above and beyond. You're my guest. I know you already did natilas yadayim, and I'm going to say, let me bring for you the natilas yadayim. And the guy says, and I said, no, I'll do it. I know the guy is saying no because he did it already. Just as another example. Or it's any type of gift or even service that I already know the recipient doesn't need, which means he's going to refuse. But I keep on insisting, that's called Genevas Dahas. That Yada Duhur Achitz, the host knows that this guest already washed his hands, but for whom Matrachi Lave, he's troubling himself. Now, the Yerushalmis were great. The Yerushalmis, they took certain steps to minimize the possibility for there to be such deceptions. So what did they do? Ubi Yerushalayim, habemapich pilkei dismala liyamina. They would have some sort of sleeve strap called a pilkei. And when a person went into shul, this is how it worked. If they needed an invitation, if they still didn't have where to eat, they would wear the strap on their left hand. The moment they got an invite, the moment they had where to eat, they would move it from the left to the right. Why would they do that? Because the guest didn't want to be deceived by other people in the shul, by others inviting him, ki'ilu, wow, we all want you to eat over. No one invited anyone who had this pilkei on the right sleeve. No, they made it obvious that they are already invited. So no one should be able to pretend to invite them under the pretext that I don't know that you have where to eat. There's an expression in modern Hebrew today. Don't be a what's it called? Don't be naive. How do they call it? They're very sensitive Israelis for this. The word is going to come to you. Don't be a frayer. I'll be a frayer. That's it. Because what a frayer means that you were gullible to deception. And Yerushalmis, from already in this time, they took extra steps. The Babylonians didn't care. And by the way, the Babylonians, maybe they didn't put these arm bands, these sleeve straps, because maybe they wanted to get a better invitation. I know people over here that if they get a better invitation, whatever they call better, they'll go to the first toast and say, I forgot I was already invited out. The Yerushalmis would rather eat rocks, but not allow anyone to deceive them, to think that they deceived them. That's how it works.